What is going on, guys? Vanity here, back with volume 15 of the In the Style of series, this time reverse engineering the sound of Jamie XX. This is the composition I'm going to be taking you through today. From listening through Jamie's back catalogue, mainly his newest album In Colour, it's clear that every song is very different and unique. On In Colour, I didn't feel any two songs were the same or too similar, even though it still somehow felt like an album having a common thread throughout it. Whether or not you think this composition sounds like Jamie XX is irrelevant. What does matter is the analysis and information I provide, because as we all know, music is extremely subjective, and this was my take on Jamie's sound. Moving on to Jamie's biography, taken from Billboard.com. Working with and without his Mercury Prize music-winning group, the XX, Jamie XX establishes himself as a forward-thinking beatmaker and producer. Born Jamie Smith in Putney, London, he began his musical career playing the drums, but after realising he couldn't use his innovative skills on the instrument, he instead turned to the 80s Media Production Centre, which programmed his computer-based sounds onto electronic percussion pads, allowing him to play both live and in the studio. In 2008, he teamed up with former school friends to form the XX, who signed to XL subsidiary Lund Turks a year later and went on to record one of the most well-received albums of the decade with their self-titled debut. As well as reworking his own band's tracks, he also became a sought-after remixer for a number of pop artists, including Adele, Jack Pennate, and Florence and the Machine. His atmospherical versions of the latter's You've Got the Love sparked the interest of XL boss Richard Russell, who asked him to remix rap pioneers Jill Scott Heron's I'm New Here, which was retitled to We're New Here upon its release in 2011. That year, Smith also released a solo single, Far Near / Beat 4, which won critical acclaim and made it to number 128 on the UK singles charts. Also in 2011, Smith worked on Drake's album Take Care, producing the Rihanna featuring title track and also working on remixes of Radiohead's Bloom, and co-produced Alicia Keys' When It's All Over for her Girl on Fire album. The following year, the XX returned with the even more polished and subdued second album, and Smith's remixes of Reconsider, Sunset, and Missing followed in its wake. In 2014, he returned to his solo career with Girl/Sleep Sound, a sleek, propulsive single released by Young Turks. That year, he also released the All Under One Roof Raving single, a homage to rave's heydays of the 90s. In March 2015, Smith issued two singles on the same day. Loud Places, a smouldering track featuring his XX bandmate, Madly Croft, and Gosh, a hard-hitting instrumental. Both appeared on his debut album, In Colour, which also featured Sim, Fortet, Young Thug, and Popcorn, and arrived in June 2015. Okay. Moving on to his equipment, both software and hardware. From various interviews, social media posts and articles, I've put together a collection of the equipment Jamie XX uses, or at least he has used. To kick things off, he uses Apple's Logic Pro as his DAW of choice, combined with a Roland TR66 Rhythm Arranger, an Oberheim 8-voice synthesizer, and a Roland Space Echo R301. When I say he uses these, what I mean is that these pieces of equipment are part of his studio setup. As far as his live performances go, he's been seen using lots of different items of gear, including an Akai MPK49 MIDI keyboard, an Akai's MPC 500, as well as an ENS DJR400 mixer, a Bose DD3 digital delay, and a Roland RE20 Space Echo pedal. He combines this with more conventional DJ equipment such as the Technics 1210s, Pioneer's CDJs 200, and the Pioneer DJ DSI sampler. Now we know some of the equipment that Jamie uses, let's discuss his sound. As I mentioned in the introduction, Jamie's sound is really hard to pin down, which was why it was really hard to make something in the style of him. He's not really an artist you can just stick in a box and say, oh, he produces that genre. It's a mixed bag, and I think that's one of the reasons he's got such a loyal following. I've heard his sound be described as atmospheric with house and UK garage undertones, but I do think it's pretty open to interpretation. Music is always going to be subjective. I don't see the need for it to be placed in a box. However, as with any producer, there are certain production traits that are present in most of their records. I've broken his sound down into 4 pillars. Now again, this is my own interpretation, but I am interested in hearing your opinion in the comments below. Number 1 are his drums. His kick drum is low, very low, and in certain records can be hidden behind some of the bass sounds. Most of the drum grooves on In Colour were of a 4 to the floor drum pattern. The exceptions are tracks such as Seesaw, which features an old school sounding breakbeat. He said in an interview with the Creators Project that he samples a lot of drums from funk tracks, layering different hits together to form the sounds we're all hearing. In tracks such as The Rest Is Noise, I heard 808 sounding drum hits, especially on the snare and clap. Number 2, samples. He samples a lot, and more than most people think. However, he's not just using samples as they are, he's manipulating them in his own creative way, fitting them into his style of music. Take a look at his page on Who Sampled, which I've linked below for more details. The use of vocal samples throughout In Colour was very interesting too. Jamie took these clips of vocals that you normally wouldn't hear in this style of music and sprinkled them throughout In Colour, which I felt brought a lot of character to the album. Number 3, reverb and mix. There is a lot of reverb in Jamie's tracks, however it's very well controlled through EQ and compression. This gives the tracks a very nice tight feel. Everything is well compressed and sat in its own space in the frequency spectrum. This can be achieved through a number of different methods, however the track's tightness was probably some nice glue compression applied in the mastering stage of this album. Number 4, granular synthesis. Granular synthesis is a big part of Jamie's sound. I will cover this in detail a little later on when I get into the musical components in this composition, as I've got an example to show you. I've got a few side notes on his sound, which are as follows. A lot of the tracks on In Colour glide into one another, just like we're listening to a DJ set. I think this really helps solidify the whole album and bring everything closer together. This is something that I feel is important when putting together a body of work consisting of, say, 4 tracks or more that really need to flow into one another. The transitions on albums aren't always that focused on, but it's these finishing touches that can really elevate an album's sound. As Jamie incorporates a lot of analog synthesizers and hardware into his tracks, this may be something you want to have a play with too. You can always try out contact libraries for emulating vintage synth presets or download some sample packs online. Okay, now that we've covered his sound, let's move on to the composition. We'll start with the drums. Here's how they sound all together. The drum groove is made up from a kick, snare, clap, tambourine and a woodblock. It's a very simple 4 to the floor style of pattern with a couple of percussion instruments just to break up the repetitiveness. As I said before, I noticed that Jamie's style of kick drum is sitting pretty low in terms of both frequencies and the volume, which is what I'm trying to emulate here. I chose a low kick drum but also added in this EQ that's boosting 60 Hz by 4 decibels. I always use a Pultec EQ for this, as I really love how the broad curves sound on low frequencies. Again, this is my preference, and I would recommend trying to find some analog emulations if you want to bring in some character to your own mixes. The first EQ is just taking out a little dip around 500 Hz by 4 decibels, just cleaning up the kick drum, getting rid of some of the muddy frequencies. Jamie's kicks sound very well rounded, they don't have any loose ends flopping around in the mix. In fact, this kind of applies to his whole mix. Everything is tight and in place. The snare and the clap have the same EQ configuration, removing 500 Hz by 4 decibels. Altogether, the 3 sound like this. Jamie's percussion varies throughout his records. In most of the tracks, with the 4 on the floor style of drum groove, there is some kind of consistent bow or shaker that almost hides the rigid pattern of the drum groove. This is how the percussion sounds soloed. This EQ, I actually have it on every channel as a default, and I'd recommend you guys do the same with plugins you use regularly. So to do this, once you've got the plugins you want on the channel, just right click and hit Save as Default Audio Track down here. Same process for MIDI tracks too. Again though, the same EQ configuration with a low end roll off starting at 250Hz on a gradual 12dB slope. Now, you probably will have noticed that I've not used any compressors on the individual drum hits, but I have got Ableton's compressor on the drum bus just to provide a bit of glue, as the name suggests. A big part of Jamie's sound hinges on the mix. Make sure you're paying attention to bussing sounds together. All of the samples you just heard, as well as a couple hundred more, are from my Jamie XX sample pack. I've provided a link at the top of the description which will take you to where you can download it. Now that we've covered the drums, let's move on to the musical components. As I mentioned earlier, I believe a lot of Jamie's sound is based around granular synthesis. There's definitely an influence from Fortet in there too. What is granular synthesis, I hear you asking? Well, it's a form of synthesis that is in between sampling and synthesis. It is synthesis, but using audio samples. These audio files are chopped up into samples which are called grains. These grains can be different lengths, usually around a few milliseconds each. They can then be replayed, looped, and just about manipulated in any way you see fit. If you want a real world example of this in one of Jamie's records, take a listen to the beginning of Sleep Sound. In this track, I've used the Max for Life device by Robert Henke titled Granulator. It's available for a free download and I've provided a link below. Even if you don't know the device, you should all know Robert, as he is one of the co-developers of Ableton Live. From the website, Granulator 2 is described as a Max for Live synthesizer based on the principle of quasi-synchronous granular synthesis. It creates a constant stream of short cross-fading sections of the source sample, and the pitch, position, and the volume of each grain can be modulated in many ways to create a variety of interesting sounds. I've also provided a link to Robert's video about the plugin if you'd like to learn more. So, the main musical sample is from a sample pack which sounds like this, soloed. I then put the whole sample, as you just heard it, into the granulator and moved around this little loop section down here until I found something that worked. So here's what I ended up with after only a few minutes of playing around. So nothing groundbreaking, but I think hours of playing around with this can yield some really interesting results. I noticed a few field recordings and real world samples sprinkled throughout Jamie's album In Colour that I'd imagine have been processed in a similar way. Artists like Fortet are well known for this style of production. Even though it's a different artist, I've linked a video below that shows him talking about his live setup, which also incorporates granular synthesis. It's a great watch for anyone who wants to learn more about the subject. The only other musical sound I've got in here is a drone that's coming from Silent 1, which sounds like this, soloed. Sometimes in records, depending on how scattered the sounds are, it can be a safe bet to have some kind of ambient pad or drone sitting in the background that kind of pulls everything together. I mentioned Jamie uses plenty of reverb throughout his tracks. I always have 3 different reverbs set up on return channels, a short and a medium plate, and a long ambient reverb. On each of these return tracks, you can see that I've got an EQ removing everything under 250Hz and everything above 10kHz out of the reverb. EQing your reverb is super important, especially if they have long tails, as it just clogs up the mix otherwise. Same goes for delays. The last element in this composition is the bass. The bass in Jamie's records can either be an 808, a bass guitar, or a synthesized sub bass. I went for the latter option in this track, which is coming straight out of Serum. I tried to keep it simple, no need to overcomplicate the sub bass. A sine wave 99% of the time does the job just fine. I've got an EQ rolling off everything above 250Hz. Now, usually I keep it around 100Hz, but because of the bass melody that I played in, some of the higher notes are needed. The Max Bass I'm using next really is an essential plugin for sub bass. It allows speakers, or really any musical playback medium, with small speaker cones to actually pick up or hear the tune of the bass. Think earbuds for example. Here's what the bass sounds like soloed. So you can hear, if I zoom in, how these two high notes here and here sound louder than the others. The compressor will control the volume differences of this, giving us an even dynamic range across the whole sound of the bass. Having a solid, well-controlled bass in any track is quite literally the foundation of your track. Do not neglect it. Moving on to the mastering chain. We're starting the chain off with this EQ plugin, which is removing everything under 100Hz and boosting at 10 kHz by 2 decibels on the sides of the record. Cutting those frequencies out of the sides is a practice I undergo just to clean up the stereo image of the track. The boost at 10 kHz just lifts the top end and provides some sparkle, which also sounds great on vocals. I'm always rolling off everything above anywhere from 13 kHz to around 15 kHz, as it really neatens up the high end. Also, if you turn your track way up on headphones, that high end can really hurt your ears unless properly controlled. The BX Digital from Brainworks is converting everything under 250Hz to mono, which is a standard practice again for me, cleaning up any loose frequencies in the low end. I'm also boosting the stereo width of the track by 25%, which is kind of self-explanatory. The next plugin is then applying some gentle glue compression. A touch of compression in the mastering stage is usually always a must, especially if we're looking to achieve that tight and controlled Jamie XX sound. The next two plugins are the PSP old-timers, one compressed in the middle of the track and one the sides. The last plugin on here is actually now PSP's limiter. The L2 has gone. I'm always working on improving my production, and one of the components of that is my plugin selection. PSP's limiter just seems to handle a little better than the L2. It sounds a little more transparent and puts less colour on the track. But again, this is my own personal preference. The L2 is still one of the best limiters around. I'm essentially just using it to level the track to around -10 decibels RMS, while only taking off a few decibels on the gain reduction meter. I've left 0.2 decibels for any intersample peaks that may occur on the listener's end. Moving on to the last section in this tutorial, the key takeaways. Number 1. The 4 pillars to Jamie's sound. The chapter times are below, so please go back and refresh your memory on the pillars of Jamie's sound. Number 2. Granular synthesis. It really is one of my favourite types of synthesis, as it allows you to get really creative. You can pretty much use any sound that you wish and create something pretty unique out of it. Making drones and atmospheres using this method can also be very rewarding, as you're truly generating a unique sound that would be extremely difficult, nearly impossible to recreate. With addictive or subtractive synthesis, for example, your starting patch is available to anyone else using the synth, but with granular, you're starting out with whatever sound you choose. Number 3. EQing return channels. Often this is overlooked, but can drastically improve the sound and space of your mix when using multiple delays or reverbs. Make sure you're always keeping an eye on your correlation meter, which of course is measuring phase, but reverb and delay are one of the main causes of the correlation meter to go into the red. So keep an eye on that, and if you are having any issues, try and clean up your reverb with some EQing. Alright, that's all I've got for you today, guys. If you did enjoy this video, I would highly appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more of these tutorials. I'll catch you all in next week's video. I'm out. Peace.